All right. Well, hopefully you found that interesting and recognized that Clybarian clearly cannot transfer new information into long term memory, and that it really is about 30 seconds, probably somewhere between 18 and 30 seconds, where the information will decay out of his short term memory store if he's not thinking about it anymore. The fact that he kept crossing out what he wrote in his diary, things like that, where he's like, somebody else must have been writing in my diary because I didn't write this. And it's like, yeah, you did, but he doesn't remember that because after writing it down, he thought about something else, comes back, thinks, hey, I'm going to write down that I just regained consciousness, and he finds that somebody else has already written something in his diary. He's like, who's been writing in my diary? He literally cannot remember things if he gets, some kind of interruption in between. That's really clear evidence of a short-term memory store with a finite duration and then a need to transfer information into someplace deeper or more long lasting, like a long term memory store. And in the absence of that, memory is definitely transient and moment to moment. All right, so duration is about 30 seconds. The capacity of our short term memory is about 7 plus or minus 2 individual items. So that's what we call the magic number. The magic number 7 is about what we can handle without overtaxing ourselves. Some people it's more like 5, some people it's more like 9, but on average it's about 7 individual items that we can hold in our short term memory store. Now, what's an individual item is kind of up for debate because sometimes we spontaneously or with effort can chunk information in order to increase capacity. So I was thinking about back when I was a child and I would call 411 to get someone's phone number. And if the phone number, like if it was a friend that I knew from school, almost everybody's number started with 77. Almost everybody's number did in our area. And it was either 772 or 774. Those were our two sort of changes that would happen in our local area. You know when you're in sixth grade or something, you don't know a ton of people outside your area, right? So 772, 774. So I kind of could ignore the 77 part when the information would tell me that. I would need to just pay attention to whether it was a 2 or a 4. And then I was left with only 4 more digits to remember, right? Just those last 4 digits of the phone number. So really altogether I was just storing 5 digits when information would say that. So it wasn't very taxing, right? Back then, today, you might not even have the same area code as the person whose number you're sharing, even though you live nearby, right? Because people bring their cell phones with them when they move. And so you really honestly have to, if you were to try and remember somebody's phone number, recall 10 digits. Whereas when I was a child, it was more like 5, right? Because the 7-7 was pretty consistent. It started expanding as population grew. It started expanding, and then we had people with 5-3 numbers, and it was either 535 or 537. So that kind of made it a little bit more complicated. But again, you can kind of chunk. Okay, it's either 7-7, that's one number, or 5-3, that's one number. So it wasn't technically 7 digits even then. I really only had to remember I only had to remember 6 chunks of information. It's either the 7-7 or the 5-3, and then the 5 individual numbers afterwards. And you could even chunk it after that. Maybe when the number is read off to you, it makes sense to group it in sets of 2, or one. You have that one chunk of the 7-7 or the 5-3. Then maybe you have an individual number, the in the case of the 7-7, maybe at the 2 or the 4. And then those last 4 digits, maybe you clump them into two-digit numbers in your mind. So you're like 2145 instead of 2145, right? And so now you really only have 4 chunks, even if you were coming fresh on that number, right? Like you have no idea what this rubric is for how these numbers might be, and I have to remember them all individually. I've got 7-7, so I'm like 77, 2, 25, 25, 45 or whatever. I'm just making stuff up as I talk. So chunking can make your capacity look a lot larger. You can hold more information if you do it in chunks. So let's get an example. So here we have a series of, what is it, 3, 6, 9, 12 individual items, right? This is going to tax even the most flexible person's short-term memory, right? Where, at maybe 9 is pretty easy for some people. 12 is going to really tax them. 12 is a lot. Here's another series of 12 to try and remember. Now, this one, the first one lended itself to, whoops, I'm pushing the wrong button. Sorry. Um, this one lends itself to, like for me, one thing's popping out as possible cluster, the PBS. So maybe I can remember that as one chunk, but everything else I'm going to have to remember as like those first three are, sorry, the first six. I'm going to have to maybe treat as six individual items. Then I've got PBS as maybe one, and then I've got three individual items. That's 10 items. That's going to be taxing. That's hard. This one, on the other hand, we have 12 individual items, but it lends itself pretty well to chunking, doesn't it? So you have really four items, and maybe you could say, instead of having to remember PhD, BMW, IBM, and CIA, you could say something like doctorate, car, computer, intelligence, or something, government, or whatever you wanted for CIA. And then really you're only remembering four things, and words are always a unit, right? Individual initials might or might not be a natural chunk, but words are always a chunk. And so if you can remember a word and substitute for three or four or 10 chunk individual items, now you have one thing, a word that's standing in for a bunch of other things. So when I say that the capacity is 7 plus or minus 2 individual items, an item would be an individual chunk, and you can chunk in lots of ways, right? So you can really expand your short-term memory store by the process of chunking, and you can impose chunking if, like, let's say that order doesn't matter in this list. Maybe I just need to remember that the letters were there and it doesn't matter what order they're in. Maybe I would recombine them into some fashion that would make it into something sensible, something that could be an individual chunk. So if you can chunk, you can really expand your short-term memory's capability. And I think that's why, so not to be defensive about us in our modern age not having to call 411 and remember things, but I do feel like, yeah, it wasn't really honestly us remembering 7 individual items when we called information. It wasn't. It was, we had little chunking skills that allowed us to gather things. Now, one thing I will say that was an advantage back then is that we had to recognize the patterns around us so that we could benefit from the chunks, right? Hey, all of my friends' phone numbers seem to start with 77. I can forget about that part, right? Like that's an easy chunk. So that's maybe the thing that's lost with our new phones, but I don't think, our memories, our short-term memory store is always limited. It doesn't matter whether you have to remember phone numbers or not. All right, so that's our duration, that's our capacity. I'm going to stop here because in the next section, I'm going to talk about Brooks and his assertions about how short-term memory allows for coding. So let's talk about that in the next video.